Hello, I'm Jacob Reidel. I am an architect and assistant professor in practice at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where my teaching and work and research mostly has been focusing on kind of two things: the kind of the future of architectural practice and the present of architectural practice, and the workplace. So it tells you a little bit about myself. Vicky, you had a specific question you wanted us to address in this early stage?
The plane, but
oh no, that's no problem. We can go with the intro first.
Okay, sure. So we'll pass that along because I want to make sure we have time for a discussion with everyone.
Hi everyone, my name is Tiange and I'm a software designer and creative technologist currently working at IDEO. So IDEO is a design consulting firm that has global offices across North America, Asia, and Europe. And we are known for human-centered design thinking, and we design products across digital, physical, and hybrid mediums. And since the pandemic, there has been a lot of shift in the working mode that we've been conducting, and also there's different kind of design-related activities and design research-related activities that creates varying requirements for the hybridity or the remoteness or even in-person work. So there's a lot of nuance there, and happy to share a lot of kind of experiences and insights in those aspects. Yes.
Thank you for that intro. So I guess we can maybe start off with talking more about remote working and hybrid working. I think by now we all have some experience with that and know what it's like. And I think several problems about working has emerged as people go online, and Zoom fatigue may be one of them that we addressed before. Maybe let's talk about how are some of the core difficulties in remote working and hybrid working, and maybe how they amplified existing problems in the workplace even before COVID.
I'll take a stab at that. So I think what you said is exactly right. A lot of the problems that we are seeing and hearing are ones that have existed much earlier than the pandemic. It's just that this was the big inflammatory moment that brought a lot of stuff to the surface. So there has been burnout, there has been meeting, we overuse the amount of meetings that we have. And so then that gets in the way of the amount of work we can do in our regular working hours. There is similar to the 996, in the US, even though there is more sort of geographical separation of work and life balance, because we have a computer that sits in our pocket and we typically have our work emails on our phones and things like that, Slack, you are also always online and always on demand. And I think the lack of digital boundaries and lack of sort of policy around when you are intended to be online and when you are, permitted, and I put that in air quotes because human rights, but when you are permitted to be offline. I think it was Belgium who issued new laws maybe last year around the right to unplug. So Europe is doing a pretty substantial job of creating federal policies around as a worker. And it should be said, but when we talk about employees, we're really talking about knowledge workers. So this doesn't count folks who are, first line employees, people who might be in call centers or, teachers and things like that. So we're talking about, people who work in big corporate offices, most likely. So I think figuring out those boundaries is one of the areas of, major opportunity for us in the next, 3 to 5 years, is really establishing what are the time-bound things that we allow workers to not be workers and be people, and what are the rituals in which, when do we gather? Why are we gathering? Really getting intentional about when we do stuff together, why we're doing it, who needs to be there, and for what particular reasons. There's a lot of data coming around how obnoxious we are about using meetings for everything. And so then we wind up working until 9 o'clock at night because we need to do our PowerPoints and our pitches and all that good stuff in the quiet hours.
Going down the line. So
otherwise I'm just going to soliloquize this whole thing.
I think something actually recently that's been very interesting, specifically relating to the challenges and the opportunities in hybrid and remote work. A few of my students were doing research for my courses last semester, looking specifically at, in a very kind of rigorous way, a very fairly large survey of architectural practices, looking at how basically the various stages of a design project, which are part of basically the licensure process, and just surveying very simply, could these tasks be done remotely or not? And we were all kind of surprised that it was, roughly about 75% of those tasks could be done, people said could be done remotely. And what we were expecting was to see some correlation between younger practitioners, younger emerging practitioners being more willing to work remotely and the older practitioners not. There actually was very little of that correlation, and pretty much seemed consistent, which was promising. Now, the follow-up question, of course, which is going to be asked next is, should they be done remotely, right? Or is it good to be done remotely? And I think that's something I'm particularly interested in, is looking at creative professions and creative fields, which, let's be honest, a lot of the white collar jobs have some aspect of it that's creative, but my own particular interest and focus is in looking at architecture and design professions. There's a really, I'd say, very little consensus right now, in fact, if not just outright hostility to being able to truly collaborate creatively in kind of creative design professional settings. And that is, you're seeing, one just very basic reason is, that there's kind of a tunnel vision, right? That you're only working on the project or that task that you're seeing now in Zoom, and you're not really aware of all the other problems that are happening and issues that are coming up in other projects. And so much of, like, especially for younger emerging practitioners, or so much of the learning you're getting is actually through observing everything else that's happening around you. Now, I'll just add one last thing and then I'll stop talking, which is that I think that particularly in architecture, one of the major challenges, right, is that, and what we learned through COVID is the position that was most taxed in a hybrid or remote context is really like frontline managers. Right. And in a lot of surveys, those are the people who are most burnt out, the people who are really struggling the most to do their jobs. And in a lot of creative professions, I think architecture especially, management is not really seen as something that you are trained in doing. It's actually something you just get to a certain point in your career. Everyone's trained as a designer, right? You get to a certain point in your career and suddenly you're tapped on the shoulder and you're on managing a team. So in architecture, and I think this actually tracks across a lot of other professionals, there's a kind of conflation of project management and people management. And I think what hybrid and remote has really laid bare for all of us is that actually management is a skill in itself. And it's something that you really need to take seriously. Organizations need to take extra seriously if you're going to make a hybrid or remote context work at all. And that's something that architecture and many other professions, I think, have a lot of catch up to do to kind of acknowledge the importance of management and then to start kind of building training and support around management into the discipline itself. Talk more about management if we want to later on in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you both. So yeah, just like piggybacking a little bit on that management thread, like remote or hybrid ways of working actually creates like very different expectations for each individual employees towards each other in the workplace. Like if you think previously when we were like completely in person and then you're like trying to reach out to someone and with the expectation that this person could be on and about in the office, could be like talking to someone and could be completing some tasks, you don't necessarily expect them to just like give you a response in like a couple of minutes or just like, but the digital channels of communication during the remote times, actually it accelerates that kind of response cycle. It's assumed that you're like sitting at the desk like for the entire maybe like 8 hours or so, like, subtracting those times that you're away to like do a vibe break, like grab food, but you're kind of expecting like a more prompt response. And as we shift a little bit to the hybrid mode, there's currently like no standardized way to kind of channel that transparency of this other collaborator or team member of where they are, what they might be doing. So like what happens, like someone may be in the office and they're like on and about, they might be bumping into someone having like a spontaneous conversation while this other team member at the other end of the internet is trying to reach them. And that creates like this friction that's constantly existing in like the, not just the creative professions workplace, but just any workplace when you have sort of like hybrid working in place, but then also you don't have like a standardized way of knowing the status of who's in the office and who's remote. And that creates this kind of expectation gap. And that's just like one example of the friction that it could create to like a certain level of management. Like there's no way of knowing where this person's is at, and then and how that might impact the productivity that happens in the middle of the conversation. And then something else that that I want to point out is for kind of the creative practice it's specifically for the project that I've been doing. There has been a lot of like prototyping and design research and like user testing. And I think since ever since the pandemic, or like when we head into remote, there has been a lot of this kind of prototyping that happens online, where like you create like some digital mock-up pieces, and then you schedule like a Zoom interview with the stakeholders or the users that you recruit, and then you use these digital tools like Figma, which is like have very powerful kind of interactive features. You can easily just walk them through the experience and ask for their feedback. But then a reflection on this is like, does this kind of makes prototyping sort of like oversimplified? Are we just like presenting a design and asking someone for their immediate responses or their feedback? But a lot of the times when people say like they want something, it actually doesn't mean anything. They could just say they want it to anything. And also this makes it hard for us to like observe their spontaneous interactions with the objects or the prototype that we make. And that's like something that's significantly lacking in the kind of the remote mode of working. And previously there are like so many variety of ways that we can prototype, like we can go into an in-person meeting with a user, we can present them a couple of objects and see how they respond to them, or we do like co-design workshops. We fly to their city and then organize something with like a large group of people and all that kind of stuff. And now they are still like consider a bonus. Even it's like, oh, like this is like the highlight of the project because we flew out there. We like did this in-person prototyping, but actually like what it used to be is like, this is just one of those many ways that you can prototype. So it kind of shifts that like the way that the hierarchy of these kind of different ways of prototyping within the larger collection of these different methods. So like that prompts like a critical reflections on like, are we like, can we not stick to like the paper sketch and the Zoom interviews? Are we staying there too much? And how might we kind of revert back or like bring back that variety of ways that we can design for the users, for the kind of the human-centered aspect, like how do we bring that out beyond just like interviewing others through Zoom? Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for that input, and I totally agree on that. I want to add on what you mentioned about cooperation is core, especially in creative industry, and I mean across all industry. And before the panel, in our discussion, we talked about how sometimes employers are expecting people to come back to work in the physical place, but being in the same space doesn't necessarily mean that people may be working together. So I would like to move on to think about maybe what are some of the opportunities that online and hybrid working has presented us, and maybe how it has made us to rethink about the idea of space even. Space.
Come on, mix it up.
We'll mix up the order, right? Well, I think that I'm thinking, well, let's start from physical space, right? That one thing that's clearly becoming very undeniable now, you're seeing it in markets like New York, is that the move to a hybrid and online is allowing for a kind of total rethink of the need for space, right? And that's impacting the value of commercial real estate assets significantly. And you're seeing the first, this has been the case for a while, people have known it, but you're starting to see the major players in the real estate sector is acknowledging that that much of the office space in a lot of our central business districts and elsewhere is perhaps not worth what it once was. So that's actually a really, really big deal. I think that's, that will have trickle-on effects, not just trickle on, it will affect large areas of the economy, it'll affect cities. There's, again, a lot more open and honest talk about this. And the spoiler alert, right? Conversion from office to housing is not the easy fix for that, and I think there's many reasons we can get into technically, other reasons why that is a difficult shift. So that's like zooming, like macro picture, like how space is changing with this move to hybrid, because also you're looking at more and more, you're seeing organizations that are moving to hybrid first. Simply hybrid, if they're not really thinking about it, they might not pick up efficiencies, but organizations that are moving to hybrid first, I'm sure Corrinne, you can talk about this because you've seen this in your own work, like they are able to get away with or work with less space. So we're seeing, so the whole composition of our buildings is going to shift. So that's one thing. I think then the office itself, right, physical space, to be honest, like, and I do I spend in my teaching, spend time with graduate students and design students, but also students that are really business people in the executive ed programs at Harvard, where and these people out in the industry who are very much asking, okay, just tell me, what does the office of the future look like? And all I can say, the most honest answer I can give is nobody truly knows. And I think my true honest take on this is that anyone who says they know what the office of the future is just making it up, right? And the truth is, and if you really talk to people honestly about this, and designers, real estate professionals, that we really are figuring, we're kind of what the office needed, or what we need now is going to be different than what we need 6 months from now, and it's probably going to be different than what we need for a year from now, because we're truly in the middle of figuring out a tectonic shift in the way offices are being used and the way they're designed, hence the way they're designed. So what I'd say really we need in a hybrid environment when it comes to physical space is the ability really to measure what's working and what's not as effectively as possible in real time, and then to design spaces design and infrastructure design that can shift and be modified in response to those discoveries and input, which is hard, right? Like walls, people always love to talk about movable walls. Movable walls are not easy to actually pull off, but you are seeing systems emerging, and something as simple as phone booths. Have any of you seen those kind of phone booth pods, that you'll see inserted in workplaces? They now more and more will have even full conference room spaces that are, those are a way of actually tuning a space and seeing what works and what's not, what doesn't, kind of like low-hanging fruit. And I think they're really looking for systems and design approaches that allow you to change the space in response to how it's performing are really essential now in figuring out what the space of a hybrid office looks like.
So it's interesting that you mentioned like phone booth, and I think some of the ways that we can like start to speculate how the future of offices will start to look at is like, one of it is like kind of observing how people, as they are returning to work in the office, like how they're using the space. For my own experience, my own company, like the most popular space that become just like this thing that people just go first thing in the morning to try to get is the phone booth. Mm-hmm. Like everyone tries to grab one of those phone booths, and it's almost it's really interesting to see, because the phone booth is an environment in the office that most closely replicate the home environment, like the home kind of the workspace that you have, kind of like a personal like room, and then you have like a desk, and at least for some of the phone booths in my company, it has like a monitor that you can connect your laptop to, and also you are able to just bring your food in. It's just like so close to a home office environment. I almost feel like just people go there when they try to be productive, they go to a phone booth. And there is actually research saying like a lot of I don't remember the exact statistics, but definitely like more than half of the workers that are returning to work post-pandemic reported that they feel more productive at home versus they're at a workplace. So that's something that's interesting to observe. And maybe like the phone booth is something that's going to become like something that has like a relatively more important status within like the entire office space. And also I feel like it might be also helpful to think about kind of why people nowadays go to office. And if they're given the flexibility to stay at home and go versus go to the office at any given day, what they're going there for. And some answers that just like immediately come to mind. Of course, there are like a lot more, and like right now it seems like we're just like enumerating. But something that immediately came to mind is like people go there to social, to like meet people who are even outside of their project teams, to meet those and have like spontaneous conversations, and also for easier collaboration when you're in like a really tight schedule or like a sprint for a project, and like going to an office enable like interactions, like when you can like just turn around and then ask like questions, or like turn around and communicate with your team members. There are actually a lot of remote teams and projects that kind of like started fully remote at my company, and then towards the end of the project, like they just find that they had to kind of fly the whole team into like one location to complete like certain tasks. So there's something about this kind of hybridity, not on like a small kind of like weekly kind of scale, but on like more of like a project scale, or like something that spend like half a year, like you do like fully remote for a certain number of time, and then you do like fully in person. just to cater for the different efficiency that's needed or like different tasks. That might be a potential reason. And then also just like the office perks, of course, like there are certain advantage of like having things, sharing things collectively, sharing spaces, resources, and kind of like assets collectively that still is really appealing and attractive to like a lot of the workers. And also like maybe something that's like really anecdotal to the design research and brainstorming process is like we used to use this physical post-its that's like on whiteboards that you've seen like when we're brainstorming or doing research, and they're like everywhere and they don't stick to the surface. And now this process is so much, it's so much better when we shift it to like online tools like Miro or like Figma, and you have like a much better documentation process for all of these like great content that the design teams has been constantly producing day in, day out. And like for one project, we could have like a couple thousand stickers that are in one digital space that's searchable, and you never lose them. You can go back and like organize them and recluster, and that's something that drastically changed the productivity and the way that like the design and documentation is conducted.
I love thinking about Miro as like a sustainability product for strategists. If you ever go into any form of consulting and you are in like a strategy role, Post-its and Sharpies are going to be your best friends. Most people I know have their own collection at home and they bring it with them, including myself. But I think to round all of this out and kind of sit a little bit less macro than the cities talk that Jacob was talking about, there are a couple of things. So executives, like I had said, executives are really worried about what hybrid and remote first means for businesses because it's unknown and it kind of just stops there. They see this as risk to the profitability and success and sustainment of business. And I think there's also a lot of very individualistic excitement around remote, and that creates too much of a chasm between how do we sustain business but also give people flexibility and individuality that is still in the very, very early days of sorting itself out. But I think the overarching thing is we're still really grappling with the fact that everything happened in the office prior to the pandemic. Even companies that had flexibility, if you were working from home or you were traveling, that was you were outside of the bell curve. And now the role has completely shifted. The expectation or the assumption is that you're likely home or somewhere else and not going into the office. So that complete role reversal of what the office plays is really what's up for grabs. And I think a lot of the reason why no one really knows what the design of the future office is because we don't know, we haven't done the really, really detailed work on what activities do really yield better results when we are physically together. And that's the work that needs to happen over the next couple of years to really establish. And it's not even company to company, like this is coming down to neuroscience and psychology of, as humans, what yields the best results. So that way, that's the rubric executives can look at and not be afraid of allowing remote for certain kinds of activities. And, I love the phone booth anecdote. So Jacob and I worked together at WeWork and I redesigned our headquarters, which is a project I never, ever want to do again. But we needed, one of the sort of the scarcest resource was quiet. That was the hardest thing for people to find. And the result was people would, hoard the phone booths because that was their only respite. But then that meant that there was no phone booth for the people who needed to get on a conference call. And so you'd see people walking around with their laptops through the hallways having a conversation because someone was trying to focus in the phone booth. So it's interesting to see how people hack environments for what their needs are, but then what are the knock-on effects of those hacks? So we've got a lot to figure out in terms of what the needs are for collective work, not even just collaborative work. What are the things that need proximity? And then that's what will inform how we design environments. But at the end of the day, a design kit of parts is the design kit of parts. It's really, how does the Tetris board look different?
But on that note, though, I think it's just more to add, like,
Yeah.
so that's a great illustration of maybe what we're talking about as far as being able to learn and then adapt the space. Because what you ended up doing, right, in response to that, I believe,
Yep.
is you created essentially equivalent of like the absolute quiet room over
Yeah.
at, the Rock here, where you created a room where you actually could not.
Yeah.
It was almost like a library-like space to give all those people who are normally hoarding the phone booths a place to sit and work, and that worked. And also the phone booths then were designed and kind of adapted to make them comfortable, just uncomfortable enough that you wouldn't.
They were
stay,
not
so that
ergonomically
you wouldn't
viable.
stay there longer than an hour, and that was partly by like eliminating PowerPoints from them in iteration, so you couldn't charge. Unfortunately, fortunately, battery capacity is getting to the point where that won't matter very long. But at the time, we're
But we took the cushions off the
taking
chair.
out the cushions from the chair, we're eliminating that, and not really intentionally not having them be like super ventilated was the point, to make it comfortable enough for a phone call, but not comfortable enough that you'd want to spend more than an hour in it, because then it becomes a de facto office. So it sounds like at IDEO, you guys have your phone booths sound very comfortable, actually.
Yeah,
since you have
really
like
nice.
you have a monitor and a seat and everything. But so those are all design decisions, but those are all intentional, right? You can kind of tune what we need is the ability to kind of study what's working, what's not, which your team was doing, and then to be able to then tune the space to adapt it so that it actually starts to work in what is really fundamentally different ways of working.
Yeah, and I think where the bigger challenge with that, continuous improvement is what all of these environments are going to need, because what we know today is going to vary from what we know in January of 2024. And I can't even believe that's, less than 9 months away. But there's a lot of complication when it comes to procurement. So that means getting sourcing all of these materials, sourcing all of these prefabricated units, like Jacob was talking about, like the phone booths and meeting rooms, and then also the financing of it. So all of this stuff, this is really technical, so I'll do it quickly. All of this stuff that companies buy for their workplaces usually age out over a course of like 7 to 10 years. And so that means that they hang on to and use these assets for all this time. And the problem with a lot of workplaces today is all that stuff is drilled into the floor. So it's not movable, it's not changeable, it's not adaptable. And so a lot of companies are like, yeah, our hands are tied, because this stuff is ours, or we're using this until 2030. And it's kind of like, okay, well, what can we do with that? So we're kind of stuck in a hard place of, what do we do with built design? And what do we do that's enough to show progress? But what needs to happen first is the policy development and the programming and the system design of how people do work. I think a lot of the crux of the issue that we're seeing, at least in the real estate and adjacent worlds like architecture, design, workplace, is everyone is thinking about the workplace as the physical environment rather than the sort of invisible umbrella that sits over the workforce. So the workplace is really wherever you are with your company laptop doing company work. So that means it could be anywhere. I mean, I'm working here today, so my office is Brown University. So it really matters. We need to figure that stuff out first. And I think the industry is leapfrogging to the design and build because that's what we're comfortable with. That's what we know. But we need to be thinking about how we organize ourselves as companies first and foremost. Then we figure out what are the tools and resources we need to make work happen and happen well.
Yes, thank you so much for that input. And I really enjoyed the part where you talked about it's almost like there's this shift in our perception of what workplace is. Before, the default is that physical room that you're in, but now maybe online is the default. So I think it's a good time to move the topic to talk more about this relationship between working and living, because I think over the past 2 years, over the pandemic, there has been this blurring, the boundary between working and living has become blurred because of like many reasons. So maybe we can address that a bit about how this relationship has changed between life and work, and maybe some new modes of working, such as personally, I'm very interested in digital nomad, and maybe some about that.
Okay, first. So I think, yes, the boundaries between work and life have completely merged. I don't think work-life balance is a thing that exists or something that should be chased. I think you might go bonkers if you try. So it's figuring out how do you integrate aspects of work with the other aspects of your personal life. So that's just like an adage to think about. But I think in general, we need to all figure out what our different routines are. And even Jacob and I were talking about this last night of our own lives, how do we, now that we don't go to offices, how do we create these sort of like psychological like triggers of, okay, I am leaving my morning routine and going into work. Is it a workout? Is it taking a walk? Like all these things to kind of punctuate your day to let yourself know that you're doing something different. So some of those are guided by organizations. A lot of those are things that we as individuals need to figure out what works for us. But it's a lot, these are all our own personal experiments that we need to be running in addition to the work that we're responsible for, the people in our world that we're responsible to. And in terms of the digital nomadism, it's really fascinating. And I was telling Vicky, there's this woman, Alma, who is a researcher at Stanford with the economics department, and she studies the trend of digital nomadism around the world and what the implications of that are.
Just a brief pause, maybe a short introduction of what the concept means.
Yes.
Maybe it's not familiar with it.
Sure. Thanks. So digital nomadism is basically you take your work wherever you are and you can travel the world. There are folks that have been doing it long before the pandemic, spending months, basically however long you could go somewhere, either mostly without a visa. So like how long can you stay in a certain spot? That Bali is probably like remote work, center of the world. Portugal is trying to push to be a remote work center. So there are a lot of countries that are using digital nomadism and remote work as an opportunity for increased tourism and even, increased population, or like bringing in of more expats. So it's a really interesting global thing in terms of where people might, cross-pollinate or, put some roots down in digital nomadism within the context of companies. There's still a lot of tension. And, what I was saying earlier about executives being concerned about hybrid work. So that means, someone working from their home in New Jersey and not commuting into Manhattan is something that freaks them out. Someone living in Paraguay and reporting into somewhere in San Francisco Bay Area that would just make their head explode. And I think from an operational level, it's incredibly hard to operationalize to really put into practice, the processes and the systems that make folks work successfully over different geographies. There are some companies that, even in the way that they structure projects, they have certain teams living in one time zone. So at least everyone who's reading from the same song sheet, they all live, in this case, on the Eastern Standard Time. And then in terms of development, so the creation of the assets or whatever that might be is in the Chicago and Central Time. So everything is kind of chronological in terms of what section of the process they're in charge of. And the more that a workforce is scattered rather than structured is something that is still challenging to overtake.
Yes, I think maybe it's not just the workforce of a certain company scattered, but also in terms for each individual, how we work and how we perceive work is also different. I remember Tiange mentioned how maybe we think about things more on project based now. And we also talk about how maybe workplace in the future may look something like a college campus.
Right.
So yes, anyone want to take up from that?
Sure, yeah, totally. So this actually rings the bell for a couple of things. So like, as something about kind of the future project teams are more kind of like project based, and like they might have to like navigate like multiple time zones. Like this could be like a technical problem. Like how do you like even make work productive and even like make interaction productive? How do you make work productive across the different time zones? And how do you make interactions productive when you're like spread out in like something like as maybe small, like quote unquote small as a campus, or like large in like across the world. So there's like different strategies and different ways like that a project or like team can be managed and can coordinate. And a lot of these pressure actually like falls on like whoever who's leading the team and whoever who's like managing. And like unfortunately right now, I don't think there is like a one kind of sort of truth or way that will work for across like different teams for different projects. And a lot of the times the project leads are like, they could be absorbing a lot of these pressures and extra work, like creating a handoff document or creating like, it could just be as simple as like a Slack handoff message, or it could be like a whole documentation about what's being done by part of the team and what it needs to be handed off to the next time zone or for people who are working at like this different place of the world. And then there's another piece that are a little bit outside like the technical realm is like this trust element between the employers or like the workers in the company. And although like maybe this still is something that's emerging, but they are like tech companies that are a little bit of like at the maybe the front of the trend where like they're allowing their employers to work fully remote and they could work overseas in like a different country for like a certain number of days in a year. Like that's like similar to like you have like a day, like a yearly or like annual PTO kind of time. Like nowadays it's like, oh, maybe you can work, there are like 90 days that you can work, for example, outside of the country. And like that really is showing like trust, a kind of trust between like the company and its employers, they to placing like the faith in the employer, saying that even like you're working in under this environment, this different place, you're still going to be able to be productive and complete a task. And that's really like I think the goal or the kind of the purpose of what the companies are looking at in terms of like the result of this framework. But it's not easy. It's not saying like any company is able to kind of do that. And then also like there's nature of work that you just couldn't take your work to other places. There are also like confidentiality, there's also assets and materials. So it's not something that could be applied across board for sure.
I think the other thing too that you pointed out is the kind of giving a travel allowance in additional to PTO. Something that does get very, very lost in the remote work and digital nomadism conversation is taxes. You can like if you are making money in a country that you're visiting, unless there is a tax-free law that they've established in their country, they can tax you for working there. So that means you get hit with you're incurring extra taxes just because of this. And so a lot of companies were reticent for letting people, live so geographically, in dispersed areas, is because they couldn't get a handle on what the tax implications were going to be. And so we're getting a little better at the more unsexy parts of this stuff to then let all the fun stuff happen.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump in quick and just to talk a little bit about space for a second. It's interesting you mentioned the campus as a model, because I was talking recently to a real estate head at a major multinational who we were just talking about who are you looking for when it comes to design firms to hire to design offices these days, since there's so much uncertainty around what office is going to look like. And he actually admitted he's really looking for firms that have designed specifically, like have higher ed experience, have been designing campus buildings, doing campus planning, designing academic buildings. And his reasoning was that he saw those as sectors that actually knew how to design and look at kind of holistic environments, who could look at almost like hospitality and had a hospitality mindset, could look at kind of multiple different things. We're looking at whole systems and how they integrated it, and really how not just looking at kind of productivity and purely workplace. And I think that just ties into another thing you're seeing generally across the industry when you're talking about what offices will look like. You're seeing much more emphasis on hospitality, which maybe we'll see how that plays out in the long term, because there was certainly a moment when there was a lot of emphasis on hospitality in the last year or two, and people were just trying, leaders thought that'd be a way of getting employees back into the office. But I do believe there'll be a longer tail to that, where actually, like in a lot of areas, like it's about creating a complete experience. Simply just providing workstations and a coffee machine, hasn't been enough for a long time now, but that's only become increasingly apparent. So, Vicky.
Yeah, thank you for all that input. I think those are really insightful. And yes, I think I'm going to bring in, I think we can talk about more about, as we've already talked about this changing relationship between working and living. And we also address how it's kind of difficult to imagine what the future office would be like. what are some of your envisions of maybe, do you think hybrid working is something that's going to stick with us for a long time? Will it become part of our culture? And will it change our entire perception of workplace in general in the future? And also on, yeah, maybe that.
I would just say, yes, it has.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hybrid
I think
is not going away. I think a hybrid is not going away, but I don't necessarily know if hybrid is going to be the prevailing thing we talk about 7 years, like 5-7 years from now. And it's not to say that it'll age out, but it'll morph into something more permanent, which I think is the shrunken work week. So when I say that I don't like how we measure productivity, we still measure productivity the way that Henry Ford measured productivity on factory floors. So like Corrinne was able to nail this many nails in the same spot on different pieces of metal throughout her shift. As knowledge workers, that is not how work happens. It takes time to think, it takes time to develop ideas and actually articulate them in ways. So very similar to, creativity is not just for creative arts or things that are in more design focused areas. If you're coming up with ideas, that's creativity. So a lot of knowledge workers, the way that we function is we get burnt out in a 40-hour work week. And most of us are working much more than a 40-hour work week because of back-to-back meetings and having so much on our plates. And so that means that, well, from a health and wellness perspective, if you are persistently working more than 45 or 50 hours per week, you are guaranteed to burn yourself out. And so in the existing model of the modern work week, everyone is burnt out. And that's something we kind of all, generally know, but I think because we're starting to get sufficient science and actual real data around it, rather than it just being a conversation about like, oh, I'm burnt out, like we actually have legitimate things to point to. I think we're starting to be able to make a stronger case for hour reduction per week. We're seeing a couple of pilots of 4-day work weeks in Europe, a couple of 4-day work weeks. I can't remember, Amazon had one years ago. I can't remember if it's still active or not. But we're starting to see good case studies that show this plus or minus the same amount of work is getting done per week, and the quality is just as good, if not better, because people are given more time to rest and recharge and just do their natural thing. There's this book called How to Do Nothing, and it came out before the pandemic, and it basically articulates we need to have time to let our brains roam and just not be connected to doing in order to stay healthy. So it's a really interesting dynamic of hybrid is the sort of the tinder for all of this change of like, this is the first response of, well, we left and we were taken away from our offices for about a year and a half. And so now we're gradually going back, but now we're starting to evaluate how much of this thing is actually relevant. And even we were talking about it last night of, the question of how much schooling, like how many hours of schooling, how many hours of training are required with tools and technology as they stand today. And so, especially with AI, really coming up from behind, we don't really know how much, administrative labor we're all going to need to do on a week-to-week basis. And so therefore we might see, in 5-7 years, more widespread 3 or 4-day work weeks as a result.
I will just have one add-on to the previous question on maybe also share if there are any examples that you know of that are experimenting with maybe modes of working that are non-traditional in our sense, but are maybe yielding some results.
Yeah. So in England, in London in particular, I can't remember the names of the company, or it might be a collection of companies. They're the ones that are most prominently testing out the 4-day work week. And I want to say a few weeks ago, they came back with data showing this, work is still happening. Work is still successful, even though we're slicing off 1 day of the traditional 5-day work week. So that's a really good leading indicator of, all of this stuff is aiding in making decision makers feel less scared about taking this plunge into major, pretty cataclysmic change. So that's the goal, is really just let's have all of this data that makes making these choices less scary. So that's one. I think the other thing, and we talked about this when we first chatted, was Microsoft came out with some data, and it's a very small sample size, but it was pretty ubiquitous. On brain scans, I think it was like a sample size of 20 or so people, but the results were almost equal. In like, if you had more than 2 back-to-back meetings, the amount of brain activity that signaled that you were stressed just completely spiked, as opposed to if you had even just 5 minutes or 10 minutes of break in between meetings, you were able to, your brain was able to reset to a more stasis and healthy level. So again, these are all of these types of things that the more that we can prove that this is legitimate and science, like there's actually something that we can point to and say, look, rather than it being I feel this way, or I think that this is wrong. The people, there's a lot of, anything that sounds like conjecture is going to say, yeah, that's nice. The more that we can say this is concrete and here are the repercussions of it, then more people will start to think about how do we design away from those frictions, those challenges, or just those risks in general.
Thanks. Do the other speakers want to share their notes on this? And we can open up to questions after this.
I'll just say it really quick, which is just that I think the important takeaway is that work is designed, right? And, you know, it's as designed as the space itself is as designed as anything. And that, you know, even not very long ago, right, a 5-day work week was seen as an impossibility, right? That wasn't the standard. And the labor movement kind of yielded a 5-day work week, which has been now the default for 100 years and more. And that could be changing now, right? But that none of the way we've been working, none of this is inevitable and none of it is fixed. And that's what makes now a particularly incredibly exciting moment in time, right? It's like kind of a total sea change in a lot of the norms and practices we've just simply taken for granted for much of the last century. In certain types of work, I want to emphasize that this doesn't apply to every sector, doesn't apply to every job, but in the ones we're talking about in this context, mostly the white collar knowledge work, right? You are seeing like a true opportunity to redesign the entire system. And whether or not we do it is really up to us. So, you know, it's exciting.
Yeah, totally. So something that this reminds me of is really like one aspect of kind of like giving that extra time back to the people doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to use that time to relax. They have the option to, and the key is giving them that option, their agency and the ability to customize for themselves. Like there's kind of like a difference when you're working. It feels different when you're kind of like working for a company or like for an external agent, like external kind of productivity requirement versus you're like working for yourself, for your own knowledge. And like, you know, like decreasing that like work week time doesn't necessarily mean that like you're just gonna stop working, but it would give that perception back to the worker that they could still do like enrich themselves, still continue to work, but it's just for themselves. And that like that advantage or like that increase in knowledge that brings to them, or that kind of extended motivation could also potentially benefit and like goes back to their actual like work for a company. So like that could be an argument like for any kind of policymakers or like the company, the management to, you know, think more about like what this kind of decreased hours and like less in the work weeks can actually do good to them as a company.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I promise I'm done. I was speaking with the head of the communications department at Ithaca College the other day, and she had a really great analogy. Employee experience is a term that we talk a lot about in this kind of conversation. And she had a really great point of the way that companies tend to treat their employees as though they are children and the executives or the board members or the parents making decisions for them. Whereas if their employees were actually contractors, so people that they were just signing on to do the work, not necessarily get onboarded to the brand and the storytelling of the brand and things like that, they would focus a lot more on the tactical things that help people get work done. And I think we might actually, if it's done right, we actually might see a migration toward that kind of thinking of you're hiring people as contractors or like individual contributors to do a task rather than, showering them with amenities and food and parties and things like that. And so that could completely, that's a huge shift in and of itself, but it was just a really interesting thing that I wanted to put out there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think we can open up to questions to the audience now. Michael?
Thank you so much for sharing. I think you guys talk a lot about like how we can better improve productivity and the mode of hybrid working and how we can better accommodate like individual needs. But I just want to shift the discussion a little bit to maybe the aspect of like team building and team bonding.
Yeah.
Because in the Chinese work environment, there's this concept of like Tiange, which basically implies that the firm or the employers should put an emphasis on like intentionally have some activities for employees to network and to basically hang out with each other. So to my knowledge, probably prior to the pandemic, in the US work environment, people put an emphasis on like happy hours, which happen on like a casual or constant daily basis. So I just wonder, after the pandemic, in this kind of hybrid work environment, how we can have those kind of interactions between employees, and what are some effort that can be made on the firm level and on the individual level to kind of improve this kind of interpersonal relationship between workers.
I think it's a great question. And I think this is actually why I think hybrid. So like, living near an office, but not necessarily going in all the time is probably going to be the prevailing model, is so that way companies can design reasons for people to come together, not just to get work done. Tiange had mentioned it earlier of socializing. Socializing is a very, very important part of work. Executives don't like saying it, but that's how work actually does get done, is building relationships, establishing trust. All of those things are needed in order for us to work together and for it to be done successfully. So companies do have a priority that companies do need to incentivize socializing on some level. And then there's, and forget who did the research, but back in the 70s, there's this paradigm there's a sociology paper that's focuses on strong ties and weak ties. And so that's basically how you build your community. Your strong ties are the people that are in your life consistently, family, close friends, the people that, are just arm's length from you. But then the people that you pass in the library, or the people that, you get your coffee from. So people that you see consistently enough, but you don't necessarily have a deep relationship with. Those ties really disintegrated over the course of the pandemic. And those are the ones that we really need to focus on rebuilding. And so in the company context, that's how does the tech organization work with the design organization, and how do they work with the real estate, the real estate teams and things like that. So social programming, and not just like from like the woo, we're having a party, like actually figuring out how do we create the context for people to establish friendships or establish like good acquaintanceships with one another is really critical to work getting done. So it's a really good thing to be paying attention to.
Yeah, I will just say just really quick on that, like you are seeing data, coming out, new studies showing truly that in-person meetings do make a difference, right? Like have many of you seen like there was a Harvard study published very recently about business travel, and anyone familiar with this? It was kind of great. I mean, there's basically what it found was that, if you correlating direct flights between major hubs and patent applications, they found essentially with a 10% increase in direct flights, you saw 1.4% increase in patent applications in in collaborating firms, which essentially they're using patent applications as a measure, perhaps imperfect, but like as a measure for innovation. Quote, but that was showing the interesting takeaway though from that, which I thought was an interesting nuance, was that you only saw that if that benefit if you were traveling, I think it was like an hour and a half or more, right? So it meant that if you were traveling within basically a similar cultural linguistic area, like you didn't really see that benefit. Actually, like working remotely, you had pretty much, it was the same. But if you were over an hour and a half, and also if you were traveling So especially like long haul flights. And then also if you were traveling east-west, right? Like so that you're north-south, because you were not dealing with time zone changes as much. So actually where you saw the benefits was if you're making the effort to travel across time zones, meeting with people in person who are linguistically, culturally different from you, you did see true benefits. And that all feels pretty intuitive, right, to a lot of us. But the last few years have totally upended a lot of those assumptions and kind of made us think that maybe we could work without all of that. I think you're now starting to see the first round of research really reemphasizing that kind of our gut was right? That making personal connections with people, at least sometimes makes a huge difference in your ability to work with them. And I think we're in that period now of tuning what is the right mix and what do we need? And we're now in the period of discovering that. So
I feel like we're kind of in the does it bring you joy phase of like figuring out what things need to be in person and don't.
There were a couple of questions.
Yes,
Yes, can we have one more question? Okay, because we are running out of time.
we'll be around.
You guys can pick, I guess.
We-
I'm so sorry, because I didn't
Sorry,
see who
you wait, go ahead.
Thank you for amazing talk. I'm currently a freshman at RISD. I wanted to ask, so this panel is called the Virtual Frontier. And my question is on digital spaces. So there's a lot of data pointing to accelerated growth in virtual and augmented workplaces. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on implementing digital spaces with the likes of AR or VR into the hybrid workplace.
I'll just jump in really quick because I think there have been a lot of like skepticism around this you'll hear generally, right? And I'll just tell from a very personal standpoint, like this is anecdotal, but like it, for me, was very revealing. Like this was during pandemic and I had, a friend invited me to a party on Gather. And is everyone familiar with Gather? Raise nobody? Oh, okay. Oh, shoot. I don't have a slide here. Basically just imagine it's very 8-bit. It looks like NES Legends of Zelda. Like it's a top, you're looking down on this 8-bit scene and you just see like, you set up spaces and you see little avatars that walk around in it, right? So it's pretty simple. And it was someone who had invited me to a party where I didn't know anybody, right? So I show up, I log in, and I see all the avatars, and I actually felt like that feeling you feel when you go into like a house party or a loft and you don't know anybody, and you're like, oh shoot, who do I talk to, right? And I didn't have a phone to look at because it's just my avatar on screen, so you could like move around in the space. So I went into a corner and started like throwing furniture and piling them up in the corner because I was like, I didn't know what else to do. Because with the way Gather works is as you move closer and closer to a circle, like their video feed and their sound starts to feed in. So like actually has a lot of dynamics of being in a physical space because like you could see someone over there. Obviously you have like a God's eye view in this one, so the dynamics are different, but like as you get closer, you start to hear them, they hear you. So I was like trying to stay away from people because I felt like anxiety about being the only person who knew nobody at this party, but it was all ridiculous because I like could have turned this off obviously or just left. Long story short, that revealed to me that like there is a there in digital interactions, right? And Gather actually has since pivoted to really focusing on creating workplace-ish environments that are like kind of corollaries to your physical space. And we're seeing lots of other obviously development in that space. So this is from a personal experience. I do think that there is clearly a future in that, right? And we're actually not in a future, like it is being implemented now. How it's going to be implemented by organizations is actually integrated into kind of work days is very, it's to be seen. I don't know if either of you have seen that in your work.
Yeah. I can round it up, but go ahead. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of integrations, I haven't seen that kind of integrated in like a company kind of organizational level, but there are tools that could easily kind of enable anybody in an organization to create like a virtual room or like a virtual space for people to kind of gather and like Jacob mentioned, there's this Gather called software, and then there's also there's so many other things like Mozilla Hubs where you can just easily create a room and it has like all the physical sound systems and it has like you can like go into a room and then you don't hear the voices coming from the other room although you're in like the same digital space. So like everything is kind of like moving that physical aspects of the workplace into the virtual realm. But then like I guess like the question for me, at least like personally, is like, what is the actual key use case of these virtual spaces for us? Like, does it really improve our productivity, or does it like alleviate Zoom fatigue? Does it create connections that are kind of missing in like the fully remote mode? And currently, I haven't seen like really convincing and consistent usage of this virtual space that kind of solve these problems or like answer these issues in a convincing way or in a better way. And then also I think organizations or teams haven't been kind of using these things for long enough to like be able to say or testify to the assumption that might this create another form of fatigue.
Yeah.
If similar to like Zoom fatigue, this is just like another like 3D kind of virtual fatigue. So there are a lot of questions there, and I think also it takes organizations and companies resources to actually test them out and the reason, and like they won't just go out and use them just for testing out. There must be some reasons, productivity related reasons for them to actually step into this area.
Yeah, I would say I haven't really found a ton of substantial use cases outside of events. So like conferences or, hosting company town halls and things like that. Having those in digital rooms or virtual environments can be a pretty easy lift and shift from, current state. So if a company, town halls typically happen wherever the CEO or the executive team is, and usually there's a huge production team, trying to set everything up with video casts and things like that. One, maybe that makes that process shorter, maybe less expensive and easier to access. And then it can function as though like we're all at like a, global conference, and we can bump into people that are, that work in the Berlin office or the Sao Paulo office or something like that. So in terms of day-to-day use, I don't think we've really found the legitimate case yet. I think the next most logical one would be workshops, but that still remains to be seen. I think first and foremost is really figuring out where like AI stuff, like what's the name of it? Copilot. So the Copilot that's now getting integrated into the Microsoft network and ChatGPT, once that actually learns how to source the knowledge that it found, all of those things, I think those have more immediately legitimate use cases.
Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we are time up on this event. I do see a lot of questions, so definitely feel free to join us in conversations with our speakers afterwards. And please join us in giving a round of applause to our wonderful speakers today. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your insights.